You open your eyes to dust. Not the clean dust of a summer road, but something thicker, something that tastes of pulverized brick and cordite, that coats your throat and lungs with the residue of destruction. It hangs in the air like a curtain between you and the sun, turning daylight into a sepia memory, into something that belongs already to the past, even as you stand within it. It is April 1945, and you are somewhere in the shattered geometry that was once a city, perhaps Berlin, perhaps Dresden, perhaps one of 100 other places whose names have become synonyms for ending. The buildings around you no longer stand. They lean, they sag, they expose their interior lives like wounds. Wallpaper from children's bedrooms fluttering 3 stories up on walls that lead to nothing. Staircases that climb toward sky, toward absence. The sound is what strikes you first, or rather, the absence of sound. Because in the spaces between artillery fire, between the distant crack of rifles and the closer rumble of tanks grinding through rubble, there is a silence that feels archaeological, as if you are walking through ruins that are already ancient, already beyond the reach of human memory. Somewhere in this landscape of broken geometry, in a cellar beneath what was once an apartment building on Kantstrasse or perhaps Friedrichstrasse, the street signs having been consumed by fire or repurposed as grave markers, there is a man named Johann Hartmann, 31 years old, a school teacher from a small town near Heidelberg, who taught literature to children who will never finish growing up, who knew Goethe and Schiller by heart, who believed that civilization was a thing that could be preserved through careful attention to grammar and the proper appreciation of poetry. He wears the uniform of the Wehrmacht, field gray turned to something closer to ash gray, and his hands, those hands that once held chalk and turned it into words on blackboards, that corrected essays with patient red ink, now grip a Carabiner 98K rifle, though the rifle feels increasingly like a stage prop, like something from a play whose ending everyone already knows. This morning, before the sun managed to penetrate the smoke that hangs over everything, Johann woke to the sound of Soviet artillery, the Katyusha rockets that the Germans call Stalin's organs, because they scream, because they make a sound like the world ending in musical arrangement. And he lay on the stone floor of the cellar, listening to the building above him disintegrate, listening to the Reich collapse one brick at a time. His unit, what remains of it, 12 men from a company that once numbered 180, is somewhere in the rubble, scattered like seeds across ground that will grow nothing. And the orders, those orders that still arrive somehow, carried by officers who speak with the confidence of men who have already planned their surrenders, say to hold, to defend, to die if necessary for a cause that exists now only in the fever dreams of men in bunkers. But you can feel it, can't you? The way the air itself knows that something is ending, the way even the dust seems to settle with a kind of finality, because this is not the middle of the story. This is the last page, the moment when all the threads that have been pulled must somehow resolve. Johann does not know it yet, does not know that in perhaps 20 minutes, perhaps less, he will hear a sound that does not belong to warfare, a sound that will require him to make a choice, and that choice will define what remains of his humanity, will determine whether he is remembered as a man or merely as a uniform, as a human being or as a historical abstraction. He knows only that he is tired, tired in a way that sleep cannot touch, tired of the weight of the rifle, of the weight of everything. You move through the ruins with Johann, each step
a negotiation with instability, with ground that may be solid or may be the roof of another cellar, another tomb. The morning tastes of smoke and something sweeter, something organic that you do not want to name, because naming it means acknowledging what happens to human bodies when they are caught between the machinery of war and the architecture of civilization. Before this, before the uniform and the rifle and the intimate knowledge of how quickly a city can be unmade, Johann had a routine, had a life whose contours were worn smooth by repetition. He woke at 6 o'clock in a small apartment that overlooked a courtyard where linden trees grew, trees that are probably kindling now, probably ash. He made coffee with careful precision, because even on a teacher's salary, even in wartime, there were small dignities worth preserving. His students, children aged 12 to 14, faces that blend together now in memory, faces that he tries not to think about, because wondering where they are, whether they survived the bombing, whether they were conscripted into the Volkssturm, the People's Army that takes boys and old men and calls them soldiers, that wondering leads nowhere good, leads only to a paralysis that is more dangerous than enemy fire. He remembers teaching them about Faust, about the man who traded his soul for knowledge, for power, and how the irony seemed distant then, seemed like something that belonged to literature, to the safe examination of moral questions in the abstract. But now, crouched in the skeleton of a building, while Soviet forces advance block by block, street by street, the irony feels personal, feels like something with teeth. The other soldiers in his unit are ghosts already. You can see it in their eyes, the way they look through things rather than at them. There is Klaus, a butcher from Munich, who joined because he believed the radio broadcasts, believed in Lebensraum and destiny, and all the words that sound noble until you see what they mean translated into rubble and corpses. There is Friedrich, barely 18, who cries sometimes when he thinks no one is listening, who carries a photograph of a girl who may or may not still exist, who may or may not remember his name. They share what remains of their rations, hard bread that could break teeth, ersatz coffee made from acorns, from desperation, and they do not talk about surrender, because there are still SS units in the city, still fanatics who hang deserters from lampposts with signs around their necks, still the apparatus of a dying regime that will kill its own rather than acknowledge reality. The temperature is mild for April, perhaps 12 degrees Celsius, which feels like a mercy, like a small kindness from a universe that owes them nothing. But the warmth also means that bodies decay faster, that the smell intensifies, that spring itself becomes complicit in the horror. Johann thinks about his wife, Anna, who was evacuated to Bavaria, to a village near the Alps, where theoretically the war has not reached, where theoretically there are still farms and churches and the possibility of ordinary life. He has not heard from her in 6 weeks, the postal system having collapsed along with everything else, and he constructs fantasies in the silence, imagines her safe, imagines a future where they sit together, and he tells her edited versions of what he saw, versions that leave out the parts that would make her stop recognizing him. You feel the weight of these small thoughts, these fragments of normalcy that men carry into abnormal situations, because without them, without the memory of coffee and courtyard trees and the way Anna hummed while she cooked, there is only the present moment, only the rifle and the rubble and the certainty of ending. And then you hear it. Johann hears it, a sound that does not belong, cutting through the ambient noise of distant warfare, cutting through the rattle of machine gun fire from 3 streets over, a child crying, not screaming, not the sharp cry of immediate pain, but a sustained weeping, exhausted, hopeless, the sound of someone who has been crying so long they have forgotten what silence feels like.
You freeze. Johann freezes. Because sound in a war zone is information, is survival data. And this sound carries with it a complexity that makes the rifle feel suddenly heavier, suddenly more like a choice than a tool. The crying comes from the building across the street, or what remains of it. A 3-story structure that has been sheared in half as if by a giant blade, as if some cosmic force decided that only partial destruction was necessary, was sufficient to make the point. Klaus touches Johann's shoulder, shakes his head, because they both know what the sound means. It means a decision. It means becoming visible. It means crossing open ground where Soviet snipers might be watching from any of 100 shattered windows, where a single moment of exposure can end everything. And for what? For a child who might already be beyond helping, who might die anyway in the next hour, the next minute, when the artillery finds its range. But you are already moving. Johann is already moving, because there are some sounds that bypass logic, that speak directly to whatever remains human beneath the uniform, beneath the careful construction of survival instinct. His rifle hangs loose on its sling, useless now, because what good is a weapon against the vulnerability of a child's crying? The street between buildings is perhaps 20 meters, might as well be 20 kilometers, every meter exposed, every step a small prayer. And the dust swirls in eddies around his boots, rises like smoke, like the ghosts of all the people who once walked this street, carrying groceries, carrying briefcases, carrying the ordinary cargo of civilian life. He reaches the building, presses against the wall, and the crying is louder now, is coming from somewhere inside, somewhere in the interior darkness where staircases have collapsed into abstract sculpture, where floors have become walls and walls have become floors. And he calls out, carefully, in German first, then in his broken Russian, the few words he learned from prisoners, from the brief moments of human contact that punctuate the machinery of combat. The crying stops, which is somehow worse than the sound continuing, worse because it suggests awareness, suggests fear, suggests that even children in this place have learned that silence is survival. And Johann calls again, softer now, using the voice he once used in classrooms, the voice that convinced students they were safe enough to risk answering questions, to risk being wrong. Movement, in the shadows, and then you see him, a boy, perhaps 7 years old, perhaps 8, age becoming difficult to determine when hunger has stolen the usual markers, when trauma has added decades to eyes that should still believe in kindness. His left leg is twisted beneath him, broken, the bone visible through torn cloth, through skin that is too pale, that speaks of blood loss and shock and time running out. The boy's eyes are dark, Slavic,
Russian or perhaps Polish, one of the displaced millions that the war has scattered like leaves. And he looks at Johann's uniform, at the insignia that marks him as enemy, as the men who brought this destruction, and you can see the calculation happening, the terrible mathematics that a child should never have to perform, whether the monster in uniform is more or less dangerous than staying here alone, than dying slowly in the rubble. Johann kneels, slowly, makes himself smaller, less threatening, and he extends his hand, that hand that once held chalk, that corrected essays, that belongs to a person who existed before all of this. And he waits, because you cannot force trust, cannot manufacture it from fear. The boy does not take his hand, but he does not pull away either, and Johann can see the decision forming, can see the moment when survival instinct overrides everything else, when the need for help becomes greater than the identity of the helper. And when the boy nods, just slightly, just enough, Johann moves forward. The leg is bad, worse than it appeared from a distance, the kind of injury that requires a hospital, requires antibiotics and surgery and all the infrastructure of civilization that no longer exists in this place. But Johann has field dressings, has morphine that he was saving for what he never quite articulated to himself. And he uses them now, carefully, while the boy bites his lip to keep from screaming, while Soviet artillery continues its patient work of erasure somewhere to the east.
You lift the boy. Johann lifts the boy, and the weight is nothing. It's almost alarming in its lightness, because children should not weigh so little, should not feel like bundles of sticks wrapped in cloth, should not fit so easily against your chest as if they were already halfway to disappearing. The boy's name is Petor, whispered so quietly that Johann almost misses it, almost loses it beneath the sound of his own heartbeat, beneath the crack of rifles from somewhere close, too close. The journey back across the street is different now, slower, because you cannot run with a wounded child, cannot move with the speed that survival demands, and every second stretched in the open is a second where the universe decides whether to be merciful, whether to allow this small act of salvation, or whether to demonstrate once again that kindness and death are not opposites, are simply neighbors in the same ruined landscape. Halfway across, the sniper finds you, or perhaps finds Johann, the distinction becoming meaningless. The bullet cracks past, so close you feel the displacement of air, feel the whisper of velocity, and instinct screams to drop the boy, to dive, to prioritize your own survival. But Johann keeps walking, keeps moving forward, because setting Petor down means leaving him, means abandoning him to whatever comes next. And something in Johann, some part that has survived the war intact, refuses this particular surrender. Another shot, this one hitting the rubble at his feet, sending stone fragments against his legs, and you can hear Klaus shouting from the cellar, covering fire, the crack of his rifle answered by others, by Friedrich and the remaining soldiers laying down suppression, creating a corridor of noise and danger that might make the sniper hesitate, make them choose a different target. You reach the cellar, stumble down the stairs, and the darkness swallows you, swallows both of you, and for a moment, just a moment, there is the illusion of safety, the illusion that stone and shadow can protect against what exists above ground. Petor is shaking, his small body convulsing with shock and cold, and the morphine working through his system, and Johann wraps him in his own coat, in the wool that still carries the smell of home, of Anna's lavender soap, of a world that feels increasingly fictional. The other soldiers stare,
because what Johann has done makes no sense within the logic of warfare, within the calculus that measures every action against survival probability. Klaus says nothing, but his eyes ask the question, what now? What do you do with a Russian child in a German cellar while the Red Army advances, while the SS still patrol for defeatists, for traitors, for anyone who suggests that perhaps the war is lost? Friedrich, young Friedrich, who cries when he thinks no one is listening, brings water, brings half a ration of bread, and he breaks it into small pieces, softens it with the water, and feeds it to Petor with a gentleness that seems impossible given where they are, given what they have all become. And you understand in this moment that humanity is not erased by war. It is merely suppressed, merely driven underground, like survivors in a cellar, waiting for the chance to emerge. But the choice Johann has made carries consequences, because by nightfall on April 24th, 1945, when Red Army forces overrun this sector, when Red Army soldiers pour through the streets like water finding its level, they will find a German soldier and a Russian child, and they will have to decide what that means, whether it is evidence of compassion or collaboration, whether Johann is rescuer or captor, whether Petor's presence saves him or condemns him. The hours pass, measured not by clocks, but by the intensity of shelling, by the gradual approach of small arms fire, by the certainty that the line is collapsing, that there will be no relief, no miraculous reversal, only the final accounting. And Johann sits with his back against cold stone, with Petor sleeping fitfully against his chest, and he thinks about the absurdity of it, the way his life has narrowed to this moment, to the protection of a single child in a world that is consuming children by the thousands. Klaus approaches, kneels beside them, and he says what they are both thinking, that when the Soviets come, when the cellar is cleared, Johann should let Petor speak first, should let the boy explain, should trust that even in the aftermath of this particular hell, there might be room for truth, for the recognition that not every German soldier is identical, that some actions transcend the uniform. You feel the gamble of it, the terrible wager, betting your life on the possibility of mercy, on the hope that the men who come down those stairs will see a wounded child and a man who carried him, rather than seeing only enemies, only targets, only the accumulated rage of a war that has taken everything. You wait in the darkness. Johann waits in the darkness. And the waiting is its own kind of death, a slow erasure of possibility, of future tense, because time in a cellar, while armies clash above, becomes something geological, something measured in the settling of dust, in the rhythm of Piotr's breathing, in the gradual acceptance that control is an illusion, that you are no longer an actor, but a witness to your own ending. The Soviets come at dawn, or what passes for dawn in a city obscured by smoke. You hear them before you see them, boots on rubble, voices calling in Russian, the methodical clearing of rooms, of cellars, of all the places where German soldiers might be hiding, might be waiting to make final gestures of defiance. And when the flashlight beam finds you, finds Johann sitting with a child in his arms, there is a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps less, when the future hangs suspended. The Soviet soldier is young, younger than Johann, perhaps 22, with a face that carries the particular hardness of someone who has walked from Stalingrad to Berlin, who has seen things that language cannot adequately hold, and his rifle is raised, is pointed at Johann's chest, and you can see the calculation happening, the split-second decision between firing and waiting, between ending this cleanly and allowing it to become complicated. Pyotr wakes, makes a sound, and the sound is enough, is sufficient to shift the mathematics, because the child speaks in Russian, rapid, urgent, pointing at his leg, at the field dressing, at Johann, and you do not need to understand the words to understand the meaning, to understand that Pyotr is explaining, is testifying, is offering the truth as a kind of shield. More soldiers descend, filling the cellar, and among them is an officer, a lieutenant whose face is weathered beyond his years, whose eyes move across the scene with the careful attention of someone who knows that every decision matters, that every choice echoes. He looks at Pyotr, at the improvised splint, at the morphine syrette discarded on the floor, at Johann's empty hands, at the rifle that lies across the room, deliberately distant, deliberately abandoned. The lieutenant speaks German, learned perhaps in university, perhaps from prisoners, and he asks Johann one question, only one: why? And Johann has no answer that makes sense, no explanation that fits the enormity of what has happened. So he tells the truth, the simple, inadequate truth, that he heard a child crying, that he is a teacher, that some things remain obligatory even when everything else has failed. You watch the officer's face, watch something shift behind his eyes, some decision forming that has nothing to do with military protocol, nothing to do with the justified rage that any Soviet soldier might feel toward a German in uniform, and he nods once and orders his men to lower their weapons, orders them to bring a medic for Pyotr, orders them to take Johann prisoner, but with an emphasis that suggests protection rather than punishment. The war ends 5 days later, on May 8, 1945, when the instruments of surrender are signed, and the machinery of violence finally stops grinding. But for Johann, it ends in that cellar, in the moment when mercy proves possible, when a Soviet officer chooses to see a man rather than an enemy, to see an action rather than a uniform. In the prisoner of war camp near Kiev, where Johann will spend the next 3 years, he learns that Pyotr survived, that the leg was saved, that the boy was reunited with an aunt who had been searching through the rubble of a dozen cities, trying to find what remained of family, trying to gather the scattered pieces of a life that war had exploded across Eastern Europe. And this knowledge, this small confirmation that one child lived, becomes the thing Johann carries, becomes the counterweight to everything else he witnessed, everything else he participated in, everything else that cannot be undone. You understand now, standing here in the future, in the safety of distance and decades, that wars are not fought between abstractions, not between ideologies or nations, but between human beings who carry within them the full spectrum of what humanity means, the capacity for destruction and the capacity for compassion, the ability to create hell, and the stubborn, irrational, miraculous insistence on preserving life even when logic suggests abandonment. Johann returns to Germany in 1948, finds Anna waiting, finds that the small town near Heidelberg still exists, still has a school that needs teachers, and he never speaks of the war except once, late at night, when Anna asks what he carried back from that place besides memories, and he tells her about a boy named Pyotr, about 20 meters of rubble crossed while bullets searched for him, about the choice to lift rather than leave, and Anna understands, without needing elaboration, that her husband returned incomplete, that part of him remained in that cellar, in that moment of decision, in the space between the person he was and the person he chose to become. The wind still moves through the streets of Berlin, still carries dust, though the dust now is construction dust, is the residue of rebuilding rather than destruction, and somewhere in the rebuilt city, in the layers of new concrete poured over old trauma, the cellar still exists, still holds the memory of what happened there, still testifies that even in the darkest hours, even when civilization collapses into rubble, some men choose to carry wounded children across battlefields, choose to risk everything for nothing except the stubborn belief that one life, one small life, is worth saving.